The river wind carried the smell of wet stone and old leaves through the yard at Riverrun, and with it came a hush that pressed on men like a mailed hand. 2 braziers smoldered by the inner gate, their smoke drawn thin, as if even fire dared not breathe loudly in the presence of the king. Robb Stark stood bareheaded on the packed earth, the wool of his cloak snagged by the breeze. He was young, so unbearably young under the open sky, and he was a king because the North had called him one and because war had a way of pruning away anyone older. In his hands the long sword felt at once too heavy and too light. The same wind toyed with the blade and the boy that held it, indifferent as water to a drowning man. Across from him she knelt. Catelyn guor no fers. They had not made her walk the yard in chains, but the absence of them was heavier than any iron. She had chosen a simple gown of blue, the color of her house, and though the cloth was worn smooth at the elbow where worry had rubbed it bare, it was clean. When a guard had asked if she wanted a cloak, she had said no. The day was too mild to need one. The world was already wrapped in all the cold it required. The assembled lords were a shattered mirror of a kingdom. Edmure Tully stood at the fore with his jaw set and his eyes rimmed red. A hand pressed against a pillar as if to steady the whole of Riverrun through it. Brynden, the blackfish, watched without moving a muscle that did not need to move. Rickard Karstark's dark beard did little to hide the twitch that worked at the corner of his mouth. Lady Meage Mormont's hair frizzed in the damp, and behind her Galbart Glover's shoulders were a solid bar of disapproval or resolve. It was impossible to tell which from behind. Roose Bolton, pale as old milk, stood in the shadow of the tower door with his hands folded. He might have been carved there for 100 years. Robb's thoughts had been a circle all night, a ring road around the same grave. She had done it thinking she could save her daughters, thinking to trade the Kingslayer for 2 girls who wore wolf blood in a city of lions. Mercy had driven her to the cell. Mercy and desperation had done the rest. Had it been treason? Every law book pushed before him by Sakharin of the Winter Town, every scrivener's hand, every quiet council of men had named it so. She had loosed the one man who could cut to pieces the work of a year's blood, who had personally murdered sons of lords whose banners now ringed the castle yard, and she had loosed him on the promise of a word from a lion's mouth. She acted for her children, someone had said in council. We fight for more than a tree of names, another had answered. If laws are a cord, cut one strand and the rest fray easily. Robb had said little. He looked down at the sword now as if it might answer for him. It had been forged in White Harbor on the occasion of his first campaign. It had drunk men he could not name and men he would never forget. His father's great blade had gone south with a father who never returned. This steel was narrower, less beautiful, less storied, but it was what he had. He was very aware of how unremarkable it was. A sword to do necessary things. Catelyn raised her eyes, and the whole yard seemed to lean to see what those eyes would rest upon. They found Robb and did not waver. She had wept the first hours of her confinement. Edmure had heard it through the stone, and then she had stopped. The tears had been spent on one thing, and now something else had replaced them. It was not defiance. It was not submission. It was a gaze that had measured grief and found it was not bottomless. You will do it yourself, she said softly. The wind took the words and made them common air, but he heard them. There was a flick of attention from the line of lords, as if a fish had surfaced. I will, Robb said. His voice sounded like his father's in memory and nothing like his father's in the open yard. You must be quick, she said. You must be sure. A faint smile touched her mouth, the ghost of a thing he remembered from Winterfell when a boy had torn his cloak on a bramble and stood trying not to cry while she mended it. Do not let them see you fail at kindness and justice both. Edmure made a sound like a man who tried to swallow a cry and could not. Brynden's shoulders shifted, not enough to be called a step. Rickard Karstark's mouth flattened. Somewhere near the back, a fry shifted his weight, too far from the braziers to be warm and too close to be comfortable. Robb wanted to say 100 things. He wanted to ask forgiveness and to refuse it. He wanted to confess that he woke in the night clawing for the edges of his father's god's wood and finding only blanket, that he thought of Bran and Rickon every hour and tasted iron, that sometimes he heard his father's voice telling him one thing and then his mother's telling him another, and it was worse than the noise of battle. He wanted very suddenly to run. He did not run. He lifted the sword. The yard narrowed until it was a strip of earth between two rivers, and the sound of one rush drowned the other. He stepped forward. Catelyn bent her head, loose hair lifting at the nape. Her neck was pale as water in winter. He had been taught to swing with the shoulder, not the elbow. He had been taught to strike through, not at. He had been taught to look at the point he would cut and to breathe ahead of it. He had been taught that a man who passes the sentence should swing the sword because he needs to feel the weight of it from hilt to grave. Robb brought his arms down. Steel hissed air out of the way as if the sky were flesh. It was quick. It was sure. It was clean in a way that left no room for anything else. Silence took them. It was not a shocked silence or a reverent one. It was a silence like snow, absolute until someone took a step and broke it. The step came from Edmure as he stumbled forward and was held by the blackfish with a hand like a shackle. "Back," Brynden murmured. "Not for them." Robb stared down. The world swam and steadied. The sword in his hand weighed more than the boy who had practiced with wooden blades in the yard at Winterfell, and it weighed less than grief. He felt the tremor in his forearms and forced it to stillness. His mouth tasted of pennies. "The king has done his justice," Rickard Karstark said, too loudly. His breath smoked. "For our sons." Edmure turned a face to him that did not look like Edmure's face. "Do not speak of sons to me," he said, and his voice shook and cut and would not stop shaking. "Do not speak of sons." He made to go again, but Brynden's grip tightened. Robb looked for Jane on the inner balcony and found, after a moment, a glimpse of a pale hand at the edge of a shadow. He did not seek more than the proof. It was enough to know she had seen and could shape her understanding around what was done. He lowered the sword and gave it to the guard who came for it as if he had given a dead child to a stranger to carry. The guard did not flinch. "See that she has a boat," Edmure said hoarsely to no one and everyone. "Riverrun will give her back to the river, and neither bear nor fish nor crow will be allowed to forget it. By my house and by the stones under us, she will be given to the waters with honor." He turned his head to Robb. "And you will not attend." Brynden's hand found his nephew's shoulder a breath before Edmure might have said more. The blackfish looked at Robb, weighing him as he would a horse before battle. "The camp will look to you," he said. "Go there." Robb went. He did not remember the walk to his tent or the way the guards stepped aside. He did not remember pulling free of cloak and mail and leather like a man unpeeling himself. He did not remember how long he sat with his hands in the basin until the water went pink and then thinned again. He did remember the precise, impossible color of the tumblestone as it slid under the walls. A blue that had nothing to do with sky and everything to do with depth. Behind him, soft as a cat, Roose Bolton's presence filled the doorway without lighting it. "My king," the man said. Robb did not turn. "Lord Bolton, forgive me the timing." Roose did not step closer. People had died inches away from him in battle, and he had not come nearer then. Already there are whispers, and not only from the men who carry whispers for bread. The Karstarks are saying law has teeth again. The phrase say law may find theirs next. The river lords say many things. The faintest pause. Lord Edmure has called for his oars. If he wants to set her adrift with his own hands, let him, Robb said. The words were dull in his mouth. He forbids me the river and forbids me grief that looks like it. Very well. Shroud grief however you wish, Roose murmured. Let it not cover the maps. We have lost a piece today. We must place others to keep the board from falling into the river. His voice remained calm, the way a pond remains calm when a dog falls in and thrashes. Lord Karstark will act as if your deed was half his. You should be wary of gifts he chooses to make of that. His thirst is not quenched. Robb dried his hands. He wants the Kingslayer. He cannot have him. He no longer can, Roose said. He watched the slow clench of Robb's fingers around the cloth. That, too, will draw sharp decisions from blunt men. Find me Lord Karstark, Robb said. When the shadows had shifted a hand's span on the tent wall, Galbart Glover came with a word that made Robb stand without feeling his knees. Edmure had taken his sister into the water. He had shot true. Say what you would of him, he had shot true when it mattered to him. The boat burned till it was no more boat at all, only a brief, bright thing that the river accepted with the indifference of every river. Men cheered soft as if at a tourney for a child. Some of the river would carry her to the sea. Some would be drink in a cow's belly. Some would be sweat. Some would be cloud. None would be lost, not truly. It was a thought that made some men comforted and others enraged that the world did not recognize difference between the parts it broke and the parts it fed. That night the camp burned with small fires and careful talk. Men spoke of justice and of mothers in equal number and called each by the other's name when drunk. Robb did not drink, not because he was virtuous but because wine shortened the road to what was already waiting. Jane came late, hood up. She stood at the edge of the light where he could recognize the line of her cheek and the way her breath misted without recognizing anything else about her. They had spoken too quietly as husband and wife to teach each other more than the shapes of their most immediate hurts. He thought of her as soft as the stitching on a pillow, and then saw in her shadow the set of her jaw and remembered he had married the daughter of a house that had learned too much about survival to mistake silk for surrender. "Do not ask me if I rue," he said. "Ido." She took down her hood and came to him. Her hair smelled faintly of herbs. "I will not ask you to feel what you cannot change," she said. "You are cruel if you think I would need you to tell me that you bleed. Edmure forbids me the river." She nodded. "Then you will stand by a smaller one. Take a cup and pour it out. It will not be the same, and it will be exactly the same." He looked at her as if she had conjured something. Perhaps she had. But it was not the river that bent him. It was the thought of telling his men, of leading them through a winter of war without the steadying presence that had kept him from mistaking will for wisdom. He thought of the men he had sent to die and the men he would send yet. He laid a hand on her hair and she allowed him that and then put his hand aside. The night carried a rumor over the canvas roofs like a dry leaf. Young lordlings had been found with their throats cut in a dark corridor of Riverrun where the torches sometimes went out for the sake of pitch. They had been sleeping on pallets because the cells were too wet and winter was coming like a rumor itself. Their names were Willem Lannister and Tyon Fry. They had been hostages. They had been promises in the shape of boys. They were dead because men who said they wanted justice could not live with promises that kept them from revenge. John Umber said their names heavy and astonished at dawn because the world had chosen not to be sensible. Galbart Glover said them with fury. Edmure said nothing but looked at the blood dragged through his hall and then looked at his own hands. Brynden said, very simply, "This was done by our own." When they led Rickard Karstark forward through the yard 2 mornings after Catelyn had been given to the river, the Lord of Carhold did not look like a man who had decided anything. He looked like a man who had long ago set his feet on a road and found that it had only one direction. "I slew the boys," he said when asked, and his voice was the sound of wood splitting in a winter forest, "because my sons were cut down in battle by the one you freed." His eyes were bright, feverish, the eyes of a man who lived in the center of a single thought. "I slew them to make the Lannisters feel even a finger of what I have felt every hour since they were carried to me on boards." "You murdered guests who had eaten our bread," Robb said. The yard swallowed each word and spat nothing. "You murdered boys who had no sword in hand." "It is war," Rickard said. "Make your laws into shields and I will strike around them. I am a father who has lost children. Cut my head and grant the same to the lion and see if headless grief looks different on him than on me." The lords watched Robb's face. Karstark's men, hard and cold, watched his hands. "The law is not a shield," Robb said at last. "It is a blade. Cuts where it must. It cuts bitterest close to the bone." When it was done, and it was as quick as he could make it, Roose Bolton said from his place in the shadow, "The Karstarks will go. They will take their swords home and leave your lines thinner and the night louder with wolves." Meej Mormont snapped. She looked to Robb. "And if it tears a hole we cannot stitch with anything but blood, we will do that too. You have done what you must. You cannot stop there. Robb looked at the sky. It did not care for any of them. Edmure Tully was a lord now in a way he had not been 2 weeks before. Hoster Tully's sweat-slicked hand had slid out of Bryndon's and gone cold while the rushes lay quiet. The funeral had taken place on the same river that had borne Catelyn, and if you could stand in one spot and see where they both had burned, it was something to be talked around and not about. Edmure wore the lordship like a shirt that didn't fit. He could not stop picking at it. He received the words from Robb, words about strategy and the need to hold the fords and anchor the line, and he answered with words about daughters and mothers, and if his language seemed one of the softer mouths then, no one in the Riverlands was inclined to correct it with force. "I am not your boy to be comforted," he told Robb in the God's wood that served his faith poorly and his grief better. "You cut my sister." "I cut the law," Robb said. He felt strange hearing himself. He sounded like Roose, and that frightened him. "We can make a war out of funerals until none of us have breath to fight anything larger, or we can make out of funerals a reason to move. Choose." Edmure's eyes glittered, wet and hot. "I choose to hold my walls for my people," he said. "And I choose not to host the man who slew my kin. Take your banners from my gates." Bryndon's mouth twitched. Not a smile. "I do not like this," he said to no one and everyone. But he did not gainsay it. They went. The men of the Trident watched the wolves leave their river and felt an emptiness like a tide going out too far. In King's Landing, a dwarf with a face that seemed to think more quickly than it wanted to sat with a letter in hand and half a smile that had no pleasure in it. "Robb Stark," Tyrion Lannister said, "has done a thing I did not think him capable of." Tywin Lannister, head bowed over his roast, did not look up. "Then your thought was flawed. Better to think of him as a man who can do whatever his father might have done and whatever his father would not. Such men are the ones who survive long enough to become dangerous. Or to make ghosts of half a theater," Tyrion said, flicking the parchment. "This cuts him from the Riverlands. It makes him hard to love, which he needed. It makes him hard to follow, which he did not." He tapped the seal. "He has also executed Karstark. That leaves him with fewer swords and fewer paths. That is the sort of arithmetic I like." Joffrey yawned an elaborate boredom. "He killed his mother. He should have torn his own eyes out afterwards. Not if he wants to continue seeing the point of a spear," Tywin murmured. He dabbed his lips with a cloth. "Send to Lord Frey. Remind him that fancies of honor can be cured by the application of gold or flattery, and that grievances can be dressed as invitations if one chooses the right girl." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "I doubt Lord Frey has forgotten the rate at which he multiplies grievances. But I will send him another set of fingers to count them on." Sansa Stark, sitting very straight in a hall that smelled of rosemary and oil, heard two women whisper a rumor like girls share sweets. Her knife paused above a peach she had never learned to like. She stared at the pale flesh of it and felt the world turn to a kind of powder. If you press on powder, it remembers the shape of your finger for a moment and then it does not. She had thought there would be a letter, a raven song, a proclamation stamped in some red. That meant something. Instead, it was two women whispering. "What?" she said too loud. They looked at her the way a dog looks at a foundling pup. Pity with hunger under it. Later, in her cell of a room, she put her back to the door and sank down until her skirts pulled at her waist. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. It made stars while she waited for the rain to fill the space between her ribs. She did not know if the noise she heard in her throat was grief or the sound a trapped creature makes when it gnaws the thing that pins it. Out on the King's Road, in a tavern where the roof sagged and the fire took wood reluctantly, a girl in an old brown cloak listened to a one-eyed man say, "Kings and mothers, one of them is always in the way." Thuras of Myr poured wine like a man who refused to count how much had gone and how much was coming. The Brotherhood heard everything there was to hear and half of what there was not, and if this rumor had tin rings on it, it had also a weight. Arya clutched at the bench. For a moment she could not breathe. The man beside her, who had been a lord once in a place with a name and a coat of arms, put a hand awkwardly on her shoulder. It felt like he was trying to touch a flame without burning himself. "Words run faster than horses," Beric said softly. The soot on his face made his scars deeper. We will see which is true. He lifted his eyes to Thuras. If it is true, he said, and Thuras moved his mouth around his answer and did not let it out. They were miles from Riverrun. The river did not care, simply ran, on a back road that bent away from the river and through the slow, ugly belly of a marsh. A woman in a mailed shirt and a man in a chain were set upon by men who wore no colors but their own blood. The woman moved like the idea of a sword. The man laughed through his teeth and spat a curse before someone struck him from his horse. He rolled to his feet with the speed of someone who had lived his whole life knowing the floor might give way. He had the air of a man who would dive into a river with his arms tied and come out holding a fish in his teeth. Alive, someone barked, and the woman drove her blade through his thigh for the pleasure of the sound he made. They brought Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth to Harrenhal under banners that fooled no one, and the ruin took them in the way it did every living thing, as if it had been waiting specifically for them. Roose Bolton sat in the Lord's chair like a damp shadow and blinked at Jaime's stump without surprise. I prefer my prisoners unmaimed, he said in a tone that would have served equally well delivered to a butcher whose sausages were too long. But we must keep what the gods drop into our baskets. Your father will want you back. I will send you with an escort, a quiet one. Jaime smiled the way a man smiles when he has cracked a tooth. Your escort appears to have misplaced my hand. Roose did not look at Vargo Hoat or at his coarse men. He did not look at Brienne. He looked at Jaime as a potter looks at a flawed pot he has decided to use anyway. He did not say anything about a bear. At Rivermouth and Ford there were men who called Robb Oathbreaker for the mother he had sent to River and for the wife he had married instead of the bride he had promised. And there were men who called him king and did not care with what words he was crowned. The phrase wrote in a watery hand that said what they believed. A king who keeps a promise is a friend. A king who breaks one is meat on a table. They had daughters and grudges, and the second went down easier. Lord Walder wrote back that he could be reconciled if he were sweetened with spoons of sugar and if the king came to swallow. Go to the twins and crawl, the great John said, his voice rough with insult that was not all for Walder Frye. Take off your boots and kneel and kiss the old goat's rings until he tastes wolf in all the grooves. Or do not go and starve the winter in the riverlands until the snows bury you to the neck. It is a poor set of doors, my king, but one of them opens. Edmure will not ride to the twins, Robb said. He will not see me bloodied before the old man, and if I go without him, it is one more sign of the ways this war has torn what should have been sown. Your uncle has made his choice, Roose said. You must make yours. Jane's mother came to Robb's tent as if she were going to an apothecary, with need and secrets. She spoke with a soft voice about how a king's wife must hold her husband up, about how a mother might keep her daughter from harm with herbs and a hand that sometimes shook, about how some alliances were born not in the stars but in rooms where doors were shut. She did not name Tywin Lannister. She did not need to. She did not confess to what had kept Jane's belly flat. She did not need to. The room knew without being told. Thank you for keeping her safe, Robb said. The word safe made something large and wordless move under the floor of the tent. Your Grace, Cybele Westerling said, and her eyes told him that his thanks were a thing she took as carefully as someone takes a blade by its flat and not its edge. Robb dreamed of wolves. He always dreamed of wolves. In his sleep, the pack ran along the riverbank with their feet barely making a sound, and one of them turned its head and had his mother's eyes. He woke with his chest aching and the sound of the tent ropes creaking as if a ship were listing. Autumn slid toward winter. A raven from the north, fat on someone else's corn, brought a bit of the Dreadfort's red and the news that Winterfell had been burned and the hearth that had made boys into men and men into fathers smoked out into the sky. Men did not say Theon Greyjoy's name where Robb could hear it anymore. The one who did was thrown into a latrine with a sack over his head to learn that it was possible to run out of curses and still be angry. There was a bastard in the Dreadfort who warmed himself on other people's screams. There was a lord who smiled the barest tremor at the corners of his mouth when he was told of spoils. There were men in the north who ate pine bark and pretended it was bread and counted the nights until their king came home. We must go north, Robb said to his captains one cold morning when frost rhymed the buckets and horses breathed like kettles. "We must go home. You must cross," Roose said. At the twins, the river pinched the land the way a mother pinches a boy's ear when he runs past the edge of sense. The towers stood like old men with long memories and bad teeth, and between them the water narrowed to a sly grin. Lord Walder had full benches and only a little patience and a set of sons and grandsons. "It makes them thirsty. I do not know if I should give you more to drink because of it or throw you off my bridge. The two things are not different as much as one might wish." "Lord Walder," Brynden Tully said, and there was an iron in his voice that made lesser men sit straighter. "We are not in your debt for advice. We are in your debt for planks." "You will get your planks," Walder said, his mouth worming in humor. "Your uncle has brought me a gift he does not know is one. I like to see a man who thinks he is Lord learn that river and fish do not ask him for permission to be river and fish." He flapped his fingers. "Go camp in the field between my towers, and we will talk again when I have had wine. You are sure you wish to give your uncle? He is not as pretty as a daughter, but he stands straighter." Robb swallowed. The air in the hall tasted of boiled meat and old straw. He had planned, and the plan had space for a dozen humiliations and 24 slights and the rancid smell of those benches. It did not have space for the sudden drop underfoot that came 3 steps later. You could say this about Lord Walder. He knew his tellings and retellings. He knew what men liked to repeat. To break guest right was to write himself into the mouth of every river, but he adored the wet edge of that kind of fame. He prepared something that wasn't a wedding. He prepared something that would be told anyway. Men could say, "It was like a wedding," and that was enough. The camp went up in the field between the towers. Some Northmen cursed the tent pegs and some cursed the stones lined under the dirt to keep it from turning to a sea when rain came. A thin, fine rain came anyway. The fires burned and made the air taste of wet ash and mutton. Robb lay in his tent and listened to the river smacking the pier, and on the other side of canvas he could feel Gretchen's restlessness, the way a big dog's energy vibrates through the house. "Put twice as many men on the walls of the camp," Brynden said. "Those old towers have more eyes than they have windows." Roose said nothing and took his supper sitting at the back edge of the tent as if he were not part of it. He had the air of a man listening to a very faint sound that came from a long distance away. Qyburn moved like a man with a rumor and said to no one, "I saw a malformed fetus once with 2 heads and 3 eyes. It muled itself to death. No one told him to leave. They were too tired." On the second night, a minstrel came through the rain and sang a thin little song about a lord who married a miller's daughter and choked on the way the last note stretched out too long to be right. Men laughed anyway because they wanted to be the kind of men who laughed at things. Robb was in his tent when a shout rose and then cut off as if a hand had gone over its mouth. There are sounds men know even when they do not know what they mean. The thunk of a thrown thing that finds home, the small hiss of a blade into leather, that animal noise that men try to call human when they die. The arrows came like rain that had decided to be pointed. They hit the outer line of the camp and then the second line and then the men who had not yet stood. A horn blew from the north tower, a foolish, triumphant sound, and men looked up as if they could see the mouth that made it. Phrase poured out of the towers like wasps out of a hole. They wore no colors in the dark. Their eyes shone when lightning came. There had been no lightning, but there was an echo that made it seem there had. "Shields up," Brynden barked, and 2 men died with their shields still on the ground. "Circle," the great John laughed and then choked and threw his axe and it sang through the air like a thrown truth. "Wolves," he roared, and that was enough to bring men up from their bedrolls swearing. They formed a ring around the king and he broke out of the ring with them because a king who hides behind men is not a king in the north unless he is very olden. Robb was not. Roose was there and then was not. His pale cloak folding into the dark like the stomach of a fish into the river. Galbart Glover went down and came up and went down again. Meej Mormont was at Robb's shoulder snarling words the gods had not heard in 100 years. Phrase broke into the tent lines, knives for throats. Men who had eaten bread and salt the day before cut ropes for the pleasure of watching canvas fall on heads. Lord Walder was not in the camp. He was on the parapet above the inner gate with a cup in his hand and a tongue in his head and a grandson to hold the cloak around his shoulders. He watched the men below and smiled. "They told me the boy would come and be sorry," he said to nothing. "And here he is. Sorrow sits nicely on him." Robb felt the old shape of battle come up around him like a coat, and he put it on 5 times in a row. He cut a man who did not know how to wear armor, and he cut a man who knew too well. He kept moving. The circle tightened. It always did. He saw Brynden pull a handful of men into a wedge and push it toward the break in the ring. He saw the Great John reel back, and then he did not see him. He saw a fry girl in a white hood hand a spear to a boy who would not have thought to ask for one. He did not see Roose. An arrow struck the inside of Robb's right shoulder where the mail came together badly. He staggered and did not fall. He thought of his mother, and he thought of the river, and he thought of the hall at Winterfell with fire that had not learned fear yet. Then a man he knew, Robb did not know how, was in front of him with eyes as pale as old water. Robb did not remember him ever smiling. He did not smile now. "My king," Roose said. He put a hand on Robb's arm, and Robb's skin tried to shrink away from it. "You should not have done what you did." There was no heat in it. It might have been advice on how to salt fish. "You have made the wolves too small for the night." "Stand or cut," Meej Mormont rasped from behind. "Do not talk." Roose moved with a curious grace. He did not lift his sword high, because he did not need to. He did not put anger into the cut, because he did not need to. He put his whole attention into a small space and made a simple thing. A thrust between ribs where breath was trying to be. It was neat. Robb recognized the neatness even as he felt the world rush in to fill the place where the blade had been a moment before with warmth and then a sudden creeping cold. He had once, as a boy, fallen off the wall of Winterfell into a drift. He had laughed because he had been too winded to cry. He had laid there and stared up at a sky so soft it looked like it would accept anything thrown into it. He felt like that now, except the cold had hands. He folded around them. The Great John bellowed a name. Robb thought it was his. It might have been anyone's. Bolton stepped back and vanished like a candle snuffed in a draft. The ring closed. The camp was no longer a camp, but a series of small, bad dreams all happening at once. Robb sank to his knees and pressed his hand to the place where the blade had been. His palm filled with a warmth that ran like thieves. He breathed because there was nothing else to do until there was not even that. When men remember that night, they speak of the arrows, and of the way music came late. A drummer under the tower somewhere hitting the skin the way a butcher hits meat, and of the laughter from the parapet, and of the moment the king went down and how the wolves outside the camp threw themselves again and again at a gate that would not open. They speak of sweat and mud and the way the rain turned the blood to an ugly pink that soaked into leather and out of it. What they do not speak of is how quiet it was around Robb when he reached for a thought he could not find. Quiet, as if the river had apologized for being noisy and had gone still. He thought something simple. He thought, "I made my choice." And then whatever made that thought said it was time, and it became the river. After, long after, men from the hills and men from the swamps and women who wore knives and the old badges of houses that had never had a room in a castle came and looked down at a ramp of dirt that held the memory of footsteps. They found the king's tent with the cords cut and the stake holes full of water. They found men lying belly down with the fry marks sliced into their ears. They found a banner trampled. The gray dire wolf against a white field ground into mud until it was only a smear. They pulled bodies like turnips and said the names they knew and then the names that hurt to say, and then they stopped saying names because they were a river in themselves, and there is a point at which you cannot hold the water you are trying to carry. In Riverrun, where the walls watched the river with the gaze of a house that had learned to wait, Edmure Tully received the word. If Hoster had lived, he might have told his son what to do, and his son might have done it poorly and been forgiven. But Hoster had gone downriver and not come back. Edmure took the paper and stood in the hall where his sister had argued and laughed and pressed 2 fingers to his temple when a headache came. He put the paper down on the table and pressed his fingers to his temple and did not stop when the ache did not lessen. Brynden watched him and said nothing. "What would I be if I cried now?" Edmure asked at last. "A man, I suppose." "A man," Brynden said. He picked up a cup and set it down. "We are a river," your father liked to say. We go one way, no matter what stones are thrown into us. Stones change a river, Edmure said. They change its song. The sea doesn't listen, Brynden said. There was no comfort in it. There was nothing to hand men in those days that did not cut them to hold or slide out of their grip entirely. Sansa heard of the king's death in a whisper again. She was becoming an expert in whispers.
Joffrey laughed low.
Ing and loud, and the sound rolled around the smooth pillars like a game in a schoolyard. She found a corner and sat with needlework she could not see and wondered if she could sew herself into the cloth. Tyrion found her there later, small and straight and rigid, and did not try to speak comfort. He sat beside her and let the silence make a third person between them. "My lady," he said at last, "we are all a little shorter, some days." She did not ask him what he meant. There was no shape that any of this could be trimmed into that would fit the mind and let the mind sleep. On the trampled field between the towers, Frye men strode with a swagger that they would later try to make into pride. Lord Walder's sons counted heads as a man counts the legs on a plucked goose. More habit than need. They strung bodies on lines and set them out for crows, and the birds came because they believed in the ancient bargains. The wolves that had worried the outer palisade were shot one by one and hung by their feet, heavy and awkward, as if the forest itself had been punished for the wrong son. Jane Westerling wept in a room where the shutters were closed. Her mother pressed bitter tea to her lips and counted days in a whisper. The tea had a smell that would live in Jane's hair until she shaved it in a fever and it grew back coarse. Her hands found the edge of her bed and held it because it was the only steady thing in the world that was not a lie. Arya heard the news as if she had not been waiting for it the whole time. It came to her in a voice that was flat and gentle. She did not chew the meat in her mouth. She swallowed it whole, and it stuck like a small stone, and every time she swallowed she felt it again. Thuras watched her as a man watches a horse who has taken a thrown shoe. "I want to see him," she said. And Beric put a hand on her shoulder again, and again tried to be strong enough to hold her and failed with a kind of desperate tenderness. "If we run there," he said, "we will find the shape of what has already happened." "I do not care for shapes," Arya said. "I care for him." Beric's mouth moved. "So do I." Roose Bolton rode north with a wedge of men that grew behind him like the wake of a boat. On the road he gathered the broken and the bitter and the ones who had always wanted to be on the winning side and had no faith in what winning meant. He did not hurry and did not dawdle. He looked at the sky and promised himself that if the gods gave him snow on a certain day, he would close his eyes and enjoy it, and if they did not, he would not think of them again as if they were absent friends. Inside him, something like hunger devoured its way neatly through obligations. One night he sat with his face lit by a small lantern and read a letter long enough not to move except to turn the page. The letter did not say his name. It did not need to. In the north men lit fires and did not damp them for fear of what moved outside the light. There were stories of a lord's bastard who hunted men the way a cat hunts birds for sport. There were stories of a thick man who talked to his own shadow. There were stories of a fat lord in a city by the sea who smiled at the right moments and the wrong ones and put ships into water as if that were a prayer for the dead. A woman named Mormont went home with black clouds behind her and her jaw set. A man named Reed sat in a marsh and listened to frogs and did not say what he thought. A boy named Umber counted his fingers and decided to keep them all. The Brotherhood without banners found a body in reeds below a place where men had burned a camp until it was sticky and the smoke had made them blind, and then the rain had made the sticky run. They pulled her up with hooks gentle as could be managed, and they looked at her. Thuras's mouth worked around a prayer he did not believe in and then did. Beric looked at Arya because he could not do otherwise. Arya knelt on the bank and put her hand to a cheek that was colder than the water. She did not cry. She had spent tears the way a gambler spends coin. Rashly and often and always expecting the next throw to go differently. There were none for this. "Do it," she said. Her voice frightened men who had not been frightened by hanging or burning or having their sauls cut and salted because it had nothing left to lose, and it was a girl's voice. Thuras opened his mouth and shut it. The rain fell real and simple. "Not this time," he said. "The fire is a gate. Some gates are locked." If there were a woman with a scar to her throat who breathed again later in a cold wood under hanging corpses, that was another story. Thuras pressed 2 fingers to the cold skin and closed her eyes and whispered to a god he had never expected to answer. The river went on to the sea and did not pause. At Harrenhal, Brienne stood bleeding in straw and staring as men gambled over a patch of ground that the bear had churned to soup. She was very tired. She imagined the bear to be a kind of dog because she could not afford to fear it as itself. Jaime Lannister handed her a hand that was not there and pulled her out anyway, and the two of them became a pair for a moment in a world that made such combinations short-lived. In King's Landing, Joffrey declared a feast and demanded a song written about wolf blood drying on old stones. A singer delivered and had half his tongue removed when he hit a note Joffrey disliked. Tyrion drank without tasting. Tywin wrote letters without smiling. One of them went north. One of them went to a place by the river where an old man's family learned how to improve on treachery. At the twins, they tried to make a story out of what they had done that would allow them to sleep. Men are good at that. They told each other that guest right had not been offered in that tent because the bread had been eaten the day before, and if there was beer spilled then it was an accident and not a signal, and if a man with pale eyes cut the king then he had the right because of some old, bent truth. They told each other that the north was too cold to keep what it held, and that the river always takes back what you try to build in it. They told each other these things, and then they walked out to the field alone and looked down at where the grass had not yet sprung back and did not like what their stomachs did when they looked at it. In a castle whose stones remembered laughter in summer and cries in winter, a woman who had not yet learned she was to be widow twice over sat with her mother and listened while Cybele spoke of mothers and daughters as if she were telling a recipe. Jane touched her belly through the cloth because that was the language she had been taught in secret, and because it was the only voice in the room that was hers. In a marsh that smelled like rot and life thrown together and boiled, a boy with dark hair and gray eyes looked up at a patchwork sky and said nothing for a very long time. A girl with arms like reeds and eyes like bright birds handed him a cup. He drank and tasted iron. He thought of a brother who had run like a wolf and of a man with eyes so pale they were almost not eyes. He was too old for his bones and too young for what winter asked. Robb Stark had been a boy who became a king and then became a story. Stories go where they are fed. In taverns, men who had never met him argued about whether he had done right by law or wrong by blood. In a keep by the sea, a fat lord poured wine and told a southern knight that his city would always remember to put candles out for certain names. In a cave, a man without an ear told a child without a father how a king had cut his mother's head and then someone had cut his heart, and the child nodded as if it were the sort of thing that could be understood if told properly. There were men in the north who took off their shoes and walked on frost to remind themselves of what it meant. There were men in the Riverlands who would not eat bread in strange houses and who brought their own salt to inns. The phrase invited singers and made them perform and clapped at the right places. The Karstarks went home and shut their gates and waited, and sometimes they opened them to let in a hunter or a rumor. The river kept its counsel. Blackfish Brynden went from room to room in Riverrun at night listening to old walls creak. Edmure threw a cup into the fire and it did not shatter, and he felt mocked by its stubbornness. Roose Bolton stood on a battlement at the Dreadfort and let the snow fall into his open palm until it melted, then shook off the water with a look as if he had been inconvenienced by a polite guest. Jane stood at a window and watched a crow land and be black against white and told herself she would not make a sound until it flew away. Beyond the wall a wind rose that was not part of any of this and would one day be all of it. In the end there was no end. There were only so many separate pieces. A mother given to a river by a brother whose mouth had hardened. A king whose sword had cut too close and too clean. A hall that had made treachery into a dinner party and then tried to set the tables right afterward. A girl who spoke her lists like prayers and set them on the ground before sleep like traps. A man who had worn Kingslayer as a curse and had lost the hand that had made the curse matter. A lord whose eyes did not know how to be kind because they did not know how to be anything else. A river that did not change its song for grief because it was already singing grief in every note. When later summers came, they were dry. Children picked over the banks looking for metal that glittered. They found buckles and studs and the heads of arrows and charms a mother might have tied into a boy's shirt to keep him safe. They found a scrap of cloth that might have been gray once. They found a fragment of bone. They did not know what any of it meant, and they made up stories that pleased them. Every now and then, an old man would sit by the water and tell the truth the way he remembered it, which is to say the way it was for him. He would say there had been a boy who tried to be a king as cleanly as his father had told him to be a man, and that he had cut a head because he thought law needed a head, and then his own heart had been cut because men like to balance books and this was the coin they had chosen. He would say the river did not keep him because the river keeps no one. He would say he had seen the light on the water that day and it had been as beautiful as a lie. He would not say, because there is no saying such things, that when the boy had lifted his sword in that first yard the world had held its breath with him, and that when it was done it had exhaled in a way that had changed the weather in the room. He would not say that afterward the wind had come up the river like a messenger and then had gone directly on past. He would not say that because men asked for stories they could drink like ale and cough up like smoke, and there was no size of cup for that. In the north the snow fell early the first winter after the twins. It stilled men and made their voices small. At Deepwood and Barrowton and White Harbor men stood long nights and shared fires and remembered the way their king had held his jaw when he wanted to say a thing he could not, and the way his eyes had looked at a river no man commands. They were not wrong to remember him that way. They were not right. There is no right way to remember a boy the world turned into a statue and then into mud. Hounds bayed outside the dread fort. In Riverrun a woman lit a candle and then another and felt none of them help with the dark. In King's Landing, an old man wrote with a light hand on good paper that the north had been corrected and that the river had been chastened. He blew on the ink and sealed it. He died in his bed years later with warm hands and a wife in the house, and never once thought of a boy's sword falling on a woman's neck in the yard of a castle where the wind came twisted through the gate. The river went on. It ran like mercy, indifferent and continuous. It carried what men put into it to places where those things became something else, or nothing at all, or what they had always been. The story did not end in it. Stories do not end anywhere. They are like rivers in that way. They run until they meet something too wide even for them, and then they do not stop. They only become part of what has always been moving. And if you stand long enough with your feet sunk in cold mud and listen, you might hear a different note under the sound you have always heard. A low one, steady as a heart, that insists on going forward, that refuses to learn any retreat. It belongs to a boy who was a king, and to the mother he cut, and to the men who made him into a tale they told and told and told until they believed it. It belongs to all of them and to none. It belongs to the world that ate them and kept moving, because that is what the world does in the north and in the south and on every river that ever had to carry a boat with a small flame in it and the last of someone loved.